You've said you'd abolish the EPA, but as a practical matter, how would you deal with something like air pollution that crosses state lines?
Well, it's a good question. We already have 50 EPAs. Every state has one, but there are issues between the states. And in that case, I think on a case-by-case basis, then the federal government gets involved, whether it's clean air or clean water, or if it's on our international border and we need to deal with other nations. More on a case-by-case basis. But what we can't have is the current Department of EPA right now. They have essentially become a government to themselves almost, and they are changing the course of history every day.
I certainly agree with you about the aggressiveness, over-aggressiveness of the EPA, but as a practical matter, you've said now on a case-by-case basis, you don't mean that you would pass a law for every instance of a coal plant in Ohio's, pollution coming into Pennsylvania and then something else from one state to another, do you?
That's
Is that
right.
what you intend?
Well, legislation is one thing and negotiation is another. And I think that a lot of these issues can be negotiated because, again, if it's a state, let's say it's the two states that you mentioned, the two states can get together.
But you cannot just negotiate without a legal foundation and thereby compel both sides to participate. You can't do that. So what is if they won't negotiate, then what?
Well, you're making a very good point. I think that when we send the power and the authority back to the states, that's the place to begin. But there may be a need for new legislation that comes forward, or there may be a limited role within another department to be able to take care of it. I'm not opposed to the federal government. It's certainly reasonable that the federal government would have to deal with some of these issues, but let's look at what we're talking about with the EPA. Right now, they want to impose a brand new tax because of cap and trade. They're changing our economy. They're literally writing rules and taking over businesses because of what's happening with the EPA, because they're putting so many heavy burdens and requirements.
You're talking to a crowd here that are all suing the EPA in one way or another.
Thank you very much. I'm all very proud of you.
What we're trying to get at is your alternative. And I think you've probably addressed that.
And I'm not opposed to new legislation to deal with that, again, on a case-by-case basis, or if we have to have a very modified form. But the current EPA has to go.
We're at less than 2 minutes for the segment. Pam Bondi, you have the next question.
I think you'll enjoy this as a practicing lawyer, Congresswoman Bachmann. One of my favorite questions. Other than Roe versus Wade, what is the worst United States Supreme Court decision in the last 50 years? In the last 50 years, I would say that the all-time worst was the Dred Scott decision. But I think that in the last 50 years, there are so many, it is hard to choose. But I'll go with the Kelo decision. The Kelo decision offended me tremendously because it was a government entity taking away the private property interests from one individual because it would benefit government in the form of revenue, and then giving that private property to another. That's a terrible decision.
So, Congresswoman, in that regard, what would you do from the federal government's perspective to protect private property?
To protect private property, well, the federal government needs to stand up in terms of legislation and also from the legal perspective. If there's a case that goes before the court, they need to follow the Constitution, and they also need to have reference with the Declaration of Independence, because that's part of our government, that we uphold private property rights. That hasn't happened a lot in recent years, but it must.
We are in the final 30 seconds of the segment. Pam Bondi, do you have a final question?
I have a quick question, and Kelo is one of my top ones as well, Congresswoman. You've expressed support for a federal human life amendment. Why is it preferable to allowing the states to have their own policy on abortion?
Because life is the fundamental issue. If you go back to the Declaration of Independence, we have inalienable rights. Those are rights that God gives to us, not man. And so the reason why governments were instituted, according to the Declaration of Independence, was to protect those inalienable rights, which includes life.
Thank you very, very much, Congresswoman.
Thank you, Congresswoman.
Michele Bachmann.
Thank you.